Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the DMZ America podcast for Tuesday, November 19th, 2024. I'm Ted Rall, editorial cartoonist, coming to you from the left.
And I am editorial cartoonist Scott Stantis, coming to you from the right.
And Scott, it's always good to see you. The big news, there's a lot of stuff going on with the Trump transition, but most notably, there's a lot of movement in a place where there hasn't been much movement in a while, and that's in Ukraine. Basically, for the last 2.5 years, Russia and Ukraine have been locked in kind of a gruesome stalemate, even involving World War I style trench warfare. And now there's been some movement. The Ukrainians launched an incursion into Russia proper, into a region called Kursk, which is kind of rural and sparsely populated. Russia has brought in North Korean troops to help them kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk. In the meanwhile,
sure, why not?
The Russians have been making advances to most notably to Kharkiv. Kharkiv was the second largest city in Ukraine after Kyiv, and that the Russians seem to be imminently in danger of taking it for themselves. Amid all this, Donald Trump obviously had promised to bring a quick end to the war immediately. Even during his transition, he said that he was going to end the war. There's been reports that he's had conversations with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, but the Russians have denied that any such discussions have taken place, so we don't really know what's true there. We also know that President Zelensky of Ukraine has recently spoken to Trump. Trump apparently said some nice things to him, but Ukraine said, well, the war is going to end next year, probably. We don't really know what that means. That's kind of opaque. And adding to all this is the general sense that Trump wants to curtail support to Ukraine, either reduce it or eliminate it after becoming president, and wants to settle it and get a conference going, or an armistice, or a sellout, depending on your point of view. And then you're also going to get breaking yesterday was the news that President Joe Biden, remember him? Yeah, he's still technically the president. Hasn't seemed that way in, 4 years. But he just issued a diktat. That's something he's reversed himself on, a stance that he had long opposed. He did not want to allow the Ukrainians to use U.S. weapons to fire into Russia itself. The Ukrainians have fired into Russia. They've used drones and other things, but they haven't used long-range missiles. They have a missile system that has the acronym ATACMS. Those are U.S. supplied. They can fire up to about 200 miles.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there, Ted. You said ATACMS? That's
ATACMS. ATACMS. So those are long-range missile systems. It does sound like that. It's true. Well, the military, they are kind of children. And so anyway, so that's where things are going. The Ukrainians have had ATACMS for some time, but they've been told by their American sponsors that they're not allowed to use them in Russia. They can use them to within Ukraine against Russian lines and Russian positions, but they can't. But basically, that's it. And so now, the question is that I think is important to get into is, where are we now? In other words, how did we get here so far? How did the Ukrainian conflict explode in 2022? One would argue that I would be one of them, would argue that it really began in 2014 into all-out conflict. And then, what is the landing? What is likely to happen here? Can Trump bring an end to it? And what will an end probably look like? Or will there be no end? Will it just continue?
You and I have been talking about this for years, and we all have agreed on how this is going to end. I don't think it's a good ending. Ukraine certainly gets the fuzzy end of the lollipop on this, but that's how wars go. Donbass region is going to be ceded to Russia. Russia is going to continue to hold on to the Crimea. There's going to be a DMZ, no pun intended, and no shameless self-promotion, but there will be a demilitarized zone between Ukraine and Russia. Russia will get guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO. And that's how this is going to end. And, if it lasted 2 years or if it lasted 20 years, like, some of our wars recently. It seemed odd, and this is why I wanted to ask you, Ted, what your thinking is on the timing of this announcement. By the way, on a side note, if anybody, I'm sorry, we're dealing with dementia in my family. Many families across America have. Ted has. But I'm sorry, President Biden gave the announcement. He's visiting the Amazon for some reason. And he had a podium set up in front of the Amazon. Again, for reasons beyond understanding. He says what he has to say. He turns around and he starts walking towards the Amazon. Now, I haven't seen the end of the video, but I think it would be hilarious. Someone obviously had to run up and stop him from going into the Amazon and being adopted.
Joe, no.
And being adopted and raised by apes. But the timing of this is weird. The only thing I can figure is the Ukrainians who gave much money to the Bidens, although we're told by the mainstream media there is nothing to that, Ted. So how dare we even imply that somehow giving a fuck ton of money to Joe's son somehow would buy access and influence and allow you to send sophisticated weapons to them. And now in the last few months, the last month and a half of your administration, less than that, I'm sorry, it's not, about a month and a half, maybe a little more of your administration, you can all of a sudden say, you know what we said about the weapons we handed you? Just forget it. Go ahead, go crazy, have a party, kill as many Russians as you want to, throw as many missiles into Moscow as you care to. Well, you know what? Send them to St. Petersburg too. We don't care. What do you attribute? That's the only thing I can attribute this to, is that the Ukrainians are scared shitless that Trump is going to propose the peace settlement that I just outlined, and that Ted and I have been outlining for years, because that's, pretty much what we do, is, just be right and be ignored in equal parts. Ted, I mean, so is that, do you think I'm right? Do you think that's what's driving this decision by the Biden administration?
Well, they're trying to scuttle the incoming administration's policy, right? We've already heard, for example, various state governors saying, we know there's a new president coming in, and we're going to scuttle his policies domestically as much as we can on immigration, abortion, whatever. This is part of that. I mean, Biden's people, I'm going to say Biden writ large. When I say Biden, I don't really mean the guy. I mean the Biden administration, whoever's actually been
who's wandering through the Amazon now as we speak.
Right. Yeah, learning how to use poison dart guns. Biden's obviously what he's trying to do is to box Trump in. The thinking is Trump's going to cut off the Ukis. They're going to be fucked. So to put Trump.
Are we calling them Ukis now?
I didn't make that up. Other people have. It's like they're going to be they're going to be in deep shit. So we'll put incoming President-elect Trump into a box. We'll escalate the situation by having the Ukrainians fire into Russia. Then the Russians will retaliate in some way that brings NATO into it, which is, by the way, not something they're imagining, because President Putin has said that he would consider this to be a direct attack, an attack using long-range missiles into Russia proper. He would view as an attack by the United States against Russia, and would reserve the right to attack the United States itself, or any European or Western nation, or its proxies. So basically, I don't think he would attack the United States. That would be World War III. But it's like, clearly it's risking escalation. Whether or not it leads to escalation, nobody knows. But it's certainly, so the idea is that this would then put Trump in a situation where, because of that escalation, he couldn't be perceived as weak, and he would have to continue to support the Ukrainians going forward. That's clearly the thinking. It's very transparent. And I'm sure, Trump and his people are well aware of what this is about. And I think it'd probably be pretty easy to circumvent it, and to put the word to Zelensky, like, just don't. But I mean, I had this question for you, Scott, today on my other show with Manila. I did mention you. I said, this is a Scott question, so I'm going to ask the Scott the Scott question. Can you think of any other example of an outgoing lame duck president during the transition period willfully scuttling the foreign policy of an incoming president, at least overtly? I mean, I know there's been covert allegations like 1968, right? Richard Nixon apparently negotiated back channels with the North Vietnamese, stuff like that. But I mean, overtly, just like, we're going to broadcast this and let another example would be Iran and Reagan, with the beginning of the Iran-Contra thing.
Yeah, but even then, that was a year and a half before the election, so there was no incoming administration to fuck up. This is.
That would be the opposite. This would be an incoming administration. In both those cases, it would be an incoming administration fucking with the incumbent administration to reduce their chances of being reelected. That's not the same thing.
No, and this. Plus Trump's not going to be reelected. He can't be.
No.
And maybe Joe Biden's thinking of running in 4 years.
He could. Oh my God! God help us all.
I was going to say, weirder things have happened. You can go, no, it hasn't. I go, yeah, anyway. Looking at this, trying to put it into some kind of historic perspective, Ted, I can't think of any other instance where a foreign country. I mean, I'm not, and to be fair, I'm not that converse on European foreign policy, the history of it, at least, as much as I am American. From an American standpoint, quite the opposite. Even John Adams, who fucking hated Jefferson by the time he came into office, made sure that there was no war with England and no war with France. He made sure that when he left office, things were calm, things were stable, and he was handing off a stable government to Thomas Jefferson, who, as we all know, fucked him over in the 1800 election. But going forward, looking at these things, I mean, the only thing I can even think of would be Buchanan. I don't think he did it on purpose. I'm not sure Buchanan did anything on purpose. Buchanan is often referred to and considered our very worst president. I don't know and I don't think that's unfair. There are two or three others that kind of rise to that level of, badness, but Buchanan kind of set the standard, and he stumbled into. He was a pro-slavery Northerner. That's how he got the Democratic nomination. Mm-hmm. He ran against a little-known third party called the Republican Party in 1856. John Fremont was their standard bearer, and Fremont had a reputation for being a little kooky.
Yep,
kind of the Henry Wallace of his generation. I wonder what percentage of our listeners got that one, Ted?
Oh, I here on the podcast, I'm going to say probably 10%.
Yeah. I think more because we've mentioned Henry Wallace in the past.
That's true.
As a progressive. Anyway, so I think that's the only instance I can think of where one president really fucked over and sabotaged very consciously, or as consciously as Joe Biden can do anything at this stage, to really screw up this administration's policies coming in, because I think Trump has an opportunity. He has two opportunities, not just Ukraine, but also Gaza, where he's going to have a strong stance and say to the Israelis, okay, you've had your fun, time to end it. And I think the Israelis at that point will. And as far as Ukraine goes, clearly Trump has no affection for the Ukrainians. I heard something interesting on conservative radio, which I rarely listen to lately, just because it's gotten so, everyone talk radio except for this podcast has lost their mind. But they refer to Zelensky as the dictator Zelensky, which I thought was fascinating. They're not wrong.
I was going to say, yeah. Why do you take note of that? I mean, that is a fact.
Because
a dictator is someone who has absolute power, which Zelensky does, has no political opposition, which is true. Yeah. No rival political opposition media is permitted in Ukraine. All of his political opponents are either in prison or exiled or dead. So, yeah, dictator, I'd say.
Yeah, well, no, but it's democracy, Ted. That's what we're fighting for, right? That's what we're supporting. That's what we're sending massive amounts of armaments to. But it's hard to call it. It's becoming more and more of a stretch. I was just fascinated to hear that American media outlet had actually started using that phrase.
Well, these are not mainstream outlets, right? I mean, what are these?
It's a weird. Okay, this is where terrestrial radio has gotten. This is brief, but it's all syndicated now. It's not syndicated, but there's like Cumulus, or I forget what radio conglomerate this is, has one morning show for all the stations from Rhode Island to Hawaii. So it's a morning show. These guys they actually do occasionally play music, and sadly it's music I like, but I can't listen to these guys who just continually talk, but they're both really right-wing guys. So yeah, I'd say this is mainstream.
Okay.
Certainly a national show, DJs talking like this. My point is that's who we're supporting. I still come back to, I am not a conspiracy nut. I've always found conspiracies, many of them, to just be laughable, because to have a conspiracy, you can have one person keep a secret. That's pretty much it. But in terms of Joe Biden's, first of all, like I said, he's on a trip to the Amazon. He stops that to make this announcement. What do you think, Ted, is the purpose of it? I think it's twofold. I think A, they gave a shit ton of money to the Biden family. I mean, a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it's a fuck you to Trump's foreign policy.
Agreed. Okay. All right, let's talk about how we got here, right? And I think reasonable minds will differ, right? But okay, so it's 1991. So, well, we should go back to the 50s, right? So this is kind of notable. So
1850s.
Well, let's go to the 1950s. So, I mean, so obviously Ukraine was one of the 15 former Soviet republics that all became independent republics after 1991, when the Soviet Union split apart. Those were all borders that some made sense, some made less sense. And when Ukraine became an independent republic, and it's really weird, by the way the Soviet Union dissolved itself. It's good that it was peaceful, but it was done in some pretty strange ways. And basically on Christmas Day at 12 midnight, when Gorbachev broke up the Soviet Union, basically everything that was in situ, right, that was in place, became a part of that new Soviet republic, post-Soviet republic. So, for example, all the Aeroflot planes, wherever they happened to be in the former Soviet Union, became the property of that new republic.
Oh, is that true?
So, for example, if the plane happened to be on the ground in Baku airport, that became part of Azerbaijan's new national flag carrier. If it was in Turkmenistan, it's part of now Turkmenistan Air, and so on. So that's how. So you have to remember. Imagine it's a scenario. Imagine if just overnight you snapped your fingers, and there were 50 new post-American republics where there had been 50 states. Well, some of those would make sense, and some of them wouldn't make sense in terms of the borders, and some of them would be more viable, but there would be probably some border disputes in some places. And that's what happened. And it was hardly, Ukraine and Russia were not the only ones. But I think I'd like to go back to sort of, a lot of these borders were drawn by Stalin. And he liked to divide ethnic minorities, to divide and conquer them, to control them. So a great example. So some of these borders were not like that. 90% of the people who live in Turkmenistan are ethnic Turkmen. Makes sense. Turkmenistan is the homeland of the Turkmen. 60% of Uzbekistan are Uzbeks, and 40% are Tajiks. He didn't like those people. He wanted to split them up. Meanwhile, 60% of Tajikistan is Tajiks, 40% of them are Uzbeks. Not surprisingly, there's been a lot of conflict militarily and otherwise between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan over the years. And so then, World War II starts. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they came in through Ukraine. Part of that was military because it was flat as hell, and Hitler was making a mad dash for those oil fields in Baku, Azerbaijan, because he was trying to get the oil. That was like what it was about. But also, the Nazis thought with some reason that the Ukrainians hated the Soviets and would welcome them as liberators. And they were right. They did. When there was a guy named Stefan Bandera who led a pro-Nazi puppet government in Ukraine at the beginning of World War II. However, the Nazis were so insane that they started killing even their Ukrainian allies, because they killed everybody. And basically, within a year, that whole thing fell apart, and Stefan Bandera ended up forming an anti-Nazi resistance group. But he's revered today as a hero of Ukrainian nationalism. Now, Russia looks at that and they says, you're supporting you're honoring a pro-Nazi fascist puppet. That's true. He who also happens to be an anti-Nazi Ukrainian nationalist. That's true too. So it's complicated. Anyway, but the Russians remember that the Ukrainians threw roses at the Nazi tanks when they rolled in. So that's their delicate underbelly, right? And the Soviet Union lost 25 to 28 million people in World War II, more than any other nation state has ever lost in any conflict in the history of humankind. So that's a soft border for the Russians. They're not happy about that border, and there's nothing natural between Russia and Ukraine. So then in the 1950s, trying to make this a little bit nice and to show, we're all one happy Soviet family. Premier Khrushchev at the time, right, Nikita Khrushchev, decided to gift Crimea, which was ethnically Russian, historically had always been in Russia. He's like, I will give Crimea to the Ukraine. The Russia SSR now gives Crimea to the Ukraine SSR to celebrate our anniversary of friendship and benevolent Soviet brotherhood, blah, blah, blah. So, but that's on paper. That's kind of like, there was once talk of giving Liberty Island, which is part of New York City, to New Jersey, because it's actually closer to New Jersey, and actually it used to be part of New Jersey, like in the colonial era. So there's been talk about that. It's sort of be like, but who cares? It's all one country. But it matters when you're no longer one country. So so then we get into the collapse of the Soviet Union. And not only Crimea is on the wrong side of that border, with a bunch of ethnic Russians, 90+% of whom do not want to be in Ukraine, but you've also got Eastern Ukraine, which used to be the Ukraine SSR, now the independent nation of Ukraine. It's also full of ethnic Russians. We call that area the Donbass, Eastern Ukraine. And so those people also did not want to be there, but they put up with it because, for the most part, every president from 1991 to 2014 was pro-Russian. They had a good relationship with Putin. They had good relations diplomatically with Russia. Everything was fine, and that kind of kept the rest of Russian minority in the fold. Unlike in many other former Soviet republics, Russian language rights were preserved. People weren't pressured to leave. That was not the case in other places. 2014, everything changes. There's the Maidan uprising, the pro-Russian, depending on your point of view on this is either an indigenous, purely Ukrainian uprising against an unpopular pro-Russian president that led to his overthrow and he fled to Russia, or it's a CIA/Nazi-backed coup that was supported by the West and determined to tip Ukraine over to the West and try to bring it into NATO. The truth is, it's really both. There were a lot of Ukrainians who really did not like that president and wanted to be closer to the West. But there were also a lot of neo-Nazi groups like like the Azov movement, which became the Azov Battalion, who were like Banderites, that guy Stefan Bandera from World War II. And then those people come in. And then, so in 2014, he flees. Russia is like, obviously, they've lost their ally. Now, he was not a puppet, but he was definitely an ally of Russia. Russia does not recognize this coup. And Russia sends in what they call the little green men into Crimea, who are, it's kind of hilarious. They sent in Russian troops, but not wearing insignia. And they painted over their license plates on their vehicles into Crimea. And they're like, basically Putin was like, my ethnic Russian people are there. If this new Ukrainian nationalist president comes in and starts cracking down on those people, I need to protect them. So he sends in, it's a soft coup, it's an annexation. Finally, there's a plebiscite overseen by the international community, by all accounts, fair. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe supervises the election. They say, all right, this is a fair vote. Over 90% of the people of Crimea vote to go to Russia. So that's somewhat internationally recognized, but not unilaterally. Basically, from that point on, you get a civil war, right? The Donbass splits off. These two, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which are basically sort of quasi post-Soviet constructs with interesting Soviet-style flags with hammers and sickles on them. Both declare independence. They say we are autonomous republics. Good analogies, I think, for Americans who don't understand what I'm talking about would be something like Kurdistan, which is an autonomous region in Iraq. It's a de facto country, or like Taiwan, which is not really a fully independent state, but it has de facto autonomy, or the Navajo Nation, maybe, or like the Inuit Nation, Nunavut in, sort of, but I think Kurdistan might be the best example because it's effectively autonomous. And so the Ukrainian central government went to war with Donetsk and Luhansk, and they were at war from 2014 to 2022, shelling and bombing them, killing about 100,000 of the ethnic Russians during that period. Then, of course, during that period, there was something called the Minsk Agreement, which attempted to bring an end to those hostilities. The Ukrainians agreed to not consider Russia an adversary, not to join NATO, and Russia agreed back and forth to recognize Ukraine sovereignty, and we're going to be okay. Later, it turns out the Ukrainians said we were lying. We were just trying to buy time. We were crossing our fingers behind our backs. And so then, President Zelensky comes in, and he's more militant. He's more pro-American than ever. And he says, no, we're going to join NATO. And then Putin said, you are not going to join NATO at all. And he's like, yes, I am. No, you're not. The whole thing is kind of insane because, Ukraine's not even qualified to join NATO. I mean, by NATO's own rules, you can't have a disputed border and join NATO. There's a disputed border, so they can't join anyway, but unless NATO changes their rules, which they could, but anyway, that's there you have it. And so that's kind of how we got here. At the beginning of the war, Putin had he had four main principal demands. One was, I keep Crimea. We have complete autonomy or annexation of the Donbass into Russia proper, which he has now declared that it's officially part of Russia. That's not recognized by the international community, and then you don't join NATO, and and we agree not to view each other as adversaries. Basically, as we've talked about, that's probably where we're going to end up at some point. The question now is that we don't know when that some point would have been if Harris had won, maybe no time soon. But Trump presumably is not going to give as many weapons to Ukraine. And so, Russia is 6 times larger. It's a nuclear state, which Ukraine is not because it gave up its nuclear weapons Bill Clinton said, "Hey, if you give up your nuclear weapons, I'll guarantee your sovereignty, no matter what." He was holding like also crossing his fingers behind his back.
Our most honest president, please.
True. So you can sort of see why the Ukrainians would be a little bitter about that. If we had nukes, we wouldn't have to worry about all this. But here we are, right? I mean, I don't know. Do you disagree with anything that I just said?
No, I mean, that's a concise history of what we're dealing with and why we are where we are. I think the ethnic Russian things, don't forget, the Russians did that very much on purpose following the end of World War II and the rise of the Iron Curtain, or the falling of the Iron Curtain, whichever. I mean, anyway, when they put the Iron Curtain in place.
Yes, that's a good question, right? It's
did it come down, or did
the pulling of the drawing of the curtain? Yeah, I guess the drawing of the curtain would be accurate.
The Iron Curtain, that's good. And so, plus it sounds awesome.
It's almost poetic, but it doesn't sound right.
So let's try this again. So when the drawing of the Iron Curtain came across Eastern Europe, the Russians started to move many Russians, ethnic Russians, into those areas, especially from my perspective, being Lithuanian. The Baltic states have a crap ton. 25% of Lithuania at one point was ethnic Russian. I suspect that number's gone down somewhat, but not a lot. And that gives Putin his excuse to move in and do business there. The Baltic states, Finland, have been pretty scared about what's been going on and what kind of concessions Trump will make and the West will make to Russia to end the Ukrainian war. The fact of the matter is, Ted, Russia has succeeded in gaining those territories, very similar to what it did in what I call Soviet Russia, Soviet Georgia. Excuse me. They took the chunks of Georgia that they wanted back, and the world kind of went, meh. They didn't go during Ukraine, but I suspect that when a peace deal is struck, it's going to look very similar to what you and I have talked about, as I've mentioned for years. So no, I don't disagree with it. I disagree with the, Crimea was clearly and internationally recognized as part of Ukraine, and Russia went in and invaded it. They said it's ours. They had an election. You could, and there's many of us who look at that election and go, askance at the very least, and go, boy, if you're an occupied country and you have an election saying, hey, is it okay if we're here? The response is going to be fairly predictable. But you're right about the numbers of ethnic Russians in Crimea. In the Donbass region, there's there are a lot of Russians. It's been an autonomous region long before Ukraine, before this stuff had started. So where are we now, and where should we go from here? I just hope that they end the war. Wars are bad. Wars are stupid. I'm a big fan of democratic action. If the Donbass decides that, we want to go back to Ukraine, then I would hope Russia would say, okay. They won't, but you can say that. The same holds true for Crimea. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine is going to be significantly smaller on the map, but they will still be a sovereign country, which is, frankly, I was shocked that Russia was unable to effectively wipe Zelensky and his government out, occupy Kyiv, and win this war outright. They haven't done that. It's become a slog. And we just finished two really shitty wars, Ted. The United States in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We were there for 20 plus years, gained nothing, although Iraq, we're still pretty much occupying it. But, we went in and knocked out the Taliban, and guess who's in charge now in Afghanistan? The Taliban. Wars are dumb. Wars are they're a waste of time and money. There's very few you can point to say, this was a legitimate war. Obviously, recent history, you'd say World War II. But anything after that, can you think of a war that was justifiable and right? And I can't think of one. What are you going to say? Korea? No. Vietnam? No.
The Gulf War? No.
Which one?
I mean, the first one, the 1991.
I don't know about the first one, only because you're talking about national sovereignty in Kuwait, who is no friend of ours. I mean, for Christ's sake, I mean, that was a joke. The leaders left the country to go party in Dubai, and let our boys as hired help go and clean up the invasion and push back the Iraqi forces across the border. That was, at least that was handled intelligently. They got
It
to
was
the border
handled quickly.
as quickly. They pushed the Iraqi forces back into Iraq, and then they didn't pursue them.
Well, they pursued them a little bit. Don't forget the highway of death.
Well, there's that, but but in all seriousness, they didn't push on to Baghdad. They didn't push
Right.
on to occupy the country. They just said, no, the purpose of this war, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, had a very specific policy or strategic target. It achieved the target, and it was over. Then we, stumbled into a couple, 2, 3, 4 other wars, and we're like, this is one of those instances. And yeah, we can drag this out for another 15, 20 years, but to what purpose, Ted? I mean, it just makes no sense.
Sell more weapon systems. Duh.
Well, there's that. The military industrial complex continues to prosper, and
thank God for that.
And Boeing needs the money because they've had some
They've had some setbacks.
They've had a few setbacks. So why not let them send drones and bombs and let them send them flying into Moscow? What's the worst that can happen?
So what does Trump have to do? How does Trump change things, if at all? I mean,
I think, if he was
what's
smart,
the factor?
If he was smart, or in a Nixonian kind of way, through back channels, he'd let Ukraine, no, you're not going to get any more missiles. B, don't fire these into Russia. We're going to negotiate a peace, and tell Putin that that's what you're working on too, and continue to push these talks. I mean, there's no, what are the other options, Ted? I mean, other than continue the carnage? I mean, I don't, it's one of the few things I can agree with Donald Trump about. And that is that he's anti-war. Clearly, he's anti, he has a great distaste for the military industrial complex, as do I, as do a lot of people who think this stuff through. And like I said, wars are dumb. Proxy wars, I mean, this seemed like a cute idea. Oh, look, we can occupy the Russians over here, and then we won't have to worry about them over there. Well, okay,
we do that a lot, right? Doesn't this sound a lot like like the Brzezinski doctrine, right? Like Brzezinski's advice to then President Jimmy Carter, like, hey, we can give the Russians their own Vietnam. Let's finance the radical Muslim jihadis in Afghanistan. Then the Russians will go broke and get demoralized. And by the way, I think it was a contributing factor to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but certainly not by itself enough to do that. There was a lot of different things, contributing factors. It didn't help for sure.
The Nixon Kissinger idea of triangulation was, the precursor to that. Let's, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so foreign policy like that, and it made us friends with some pretty repulsive and reprehensible people.
Yep. And who, in the case of the Mujahideen, ended up, evolving and morphing, some of them, into something called Al Qaeda, which turned out to be inconvenient.
Yeah, at the very least, yes, inconvenient. And don't forget, the Shah of Iran was a buddy of ours because he kept, he was a moderate friend of ours in the Middle East. Well, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, no, no negative consequences there. And of course, you could go back to the earlier Shah, right? His dad, who overthrew Mossadegh with CIA and UK help back in 1953. I mean, so Trump's going to presumably. Yeah. I mean, look, that message has been received, whether Trump personally gave it to Zelensky or not, right? I mean, the Ukrainians read
newspapers. They did speak recently. Zelensky confirmed that they have spoken since the election.
Yeah, I mean, so what do you think is going to happen if there's a peace deal? I mean, so first of all, I don't know how this works. I mean, Zelensky signed a law that makes it illegal to negotiate with Russia as long as Putin is president. So is he going to have to repeal that law in order to not go to his own prison and be tortured by himself? Or how's that going to work?
He's going to have to pull out his own toenails. It's being a dictator, a guy who has dictatorial authority over a country, yeah, you can change the laws pretty much at your whim. So yes, of course, he'll say, well, we started back while, there's some real prospects for peace. The Ukrainian people, all they've ever wanted is peace, blah, you can blah, blah, blah this away. That said, we've been covering this stuff for so long. Whether or not there's an actual law in place doesn't really matter.
Right. So that's okay. So
do you remember when the United States
does he stay in power?
The little thing in our Constitution where you actually have to declare war. When did that happen?
5 times only.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we've only ever had 5 wars. Oh, wait.
Getting to your question about Zelensky, yes, of course he stays in power. That's one of the things he's going to negotiate, or he's going to negotiate an extremely generous pension.
Well, by some accounts, he's worth $1 billion. I guess the Ukrainian presidency pays well.
Yeah, it's one of the better paying presidencies on the planet. It reminds me very much of the Castros in Cuba, who, when Fidel died and his net worth was considered tens of millions because
Saddam Hussein also was a very well paid head of state.
Oh, that's good. I mean, because that means you attract the best and the brightest.
Yes, indeed.
It sounds like you have either construction or giant bees.
Well, it actually they're making a giant bee in the courtyard of my building. So all part of the military industrial complex, I'm sure. So I'm like, meanwhile, I have Clovis like pounding on my TV cabinet trying to get in. I don't know why, but you weird cat, what are you up to?
What do you suppose is in there?
Maybe he thinks some mouse is in there. He just wants to know. Curiosity, cats, the deal. Okay, so basically, all right. So do you think he flees into exile or?
No, I think he stays. Why would he?
I don't know. Well, I mean, don't forget he had like his approval rating was like in the teens when the conflict began, and obviously his approval rating. Nobody tests it anymore because you would be tortured if you were to give the wrong answer. But so I mean, this does leave a rump Ukraine. That is a defeat for the West, right?
Yes.
We keep losing our proxy wars, and is there any consequence to that? Does it really matter? I mean, we've lost a lot of proxy wars.
Well, what it does is it emboldens. I said Biden and emboldens Putin to, I think, continue to try to get the band back together. And whether or not he invades the biggest question mark is, does he then embolden him to invade the Baltic states, which are official members of NATO? That would be a different can of worms than invading Ukraine, which is not. Does this embolden him to do that? Yes and no. I mean, Europeans promising to be tough, looking back over the 20th century, they've never really established themselves as tough. And like, by gum, this is what we agreed to. This is what we're going to fight for. They may say, okay, yeah, there are parts of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, parts of Finland that, there's a bunch of ethnic Russians there. Legitimately, Russia has a point.
Scott, the thing is, I couldn't disagree more with you. I mean, obviously, nobody knows what lurks in the heart of Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin. But I mean, the thing is, if getting the band back together was his goal, he's blown a lot of opportunities to do that. And to do it in a frictionless way. And what I mean by that is there was something you might remember called the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was sort of a post-Soviet confederation called the CIS. And they had like loosened visa restrictions. So like, for example, if you got a visa to one of those countries, you could travel to the other neighboring countries for 3 days at a time without getting a new visa. So it's kind of like a EU light kind of deal. Putin let that wither on the vine and die. It would seem to me that if you were going to have like a post-USSR 2.0 kind of thing, you might try to amp it up rather than let it die. But more to the point, you have some you have some Central Asian republics that have tons of oil and natural gas. And those countries throughout the 1990s and most of the aughts wanted to rejoin the Soviet Union. They asked to. their populations wanted to. And I'm going to say Kazakhstan, the largest oil producing country in the world, it has 6 times more oil than Saudi Arabia. I mean, it is a monster. He could have had Kazakhstan for free. Like, it would have been like, all you had to do is sign a paper. No invasions, no sanctions from the West. Easy peasy. Didn't do it. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, the largest natural gas producers in the world, same thing. Like, could have just signed a piece of paper, come on in. He didn't do any of that, right? He had no interest. Tajikistan now has oil. It's like they do deep drilling. Tajikistan would still come in and join Russia today. So he's not doing, if he wants to get the band back, if you have Ringo and George calling and saying, like, we're in, then, and you're Paul, you're like, kind of like, why am I invading, John's house over on Central Park West when I can just, like, dudes, come on over, let's jam.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't there other ethnic considerations and ethnic baggage that comes with the Stans?
They're considered disadvantaged. I mean, in Russia, Tajiks, and particularly Tajiks and also Uzbeks and Turkmen, are looked down upon. They're kind of like considered like second-class Russian citizens. They're laborers. They're treated like shit. They're harassed by the Russian police. They're generally viewed as, like, sort of Untermenschen. But I don't know, that doesn't change any of what I'm saying. I mean, it's like they definitely, it would be popular in Russia to add, some of the band back. I mean, it just doesn't seem to me like there's literally nothing to indicate that Putin has any interest in this. And so why is he going to go invade the Baltics that basically don't have anything, right? There's no natural resources. Yeah, they have ports. Okay.
Yeah,
they have ports. Also they have an advanced technology sector, particularly like in Estonia and Latvia. But I mean, it's like, and why fuck with NATO? He doesn't want to fuck with NATO. I mean, Putin's been involved in a bunch of military skirmishes, I would say, in places like Georgia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Chechnya, in the post-Soviet space, but none of those have infringed or encroached upon NATO or its interests. So it just seems to me like he's in his own place. He's in his own sandbox. He doesn't want to fuck with NATO.
Well, you could be right. Obviously, we'll find out sooner rather than later. But this is the issue before us right now. And my guess is, tying this all together before we say goodbye, is that this move by the Biden administration is a flaming fuck you to Trump and what I believe Biden's intelligence officers are telling him about the Russian collusion, which never happened, but that's, something. Well, why quibble over the facts? And really teeing things up that when Trump comes in, he's going to have a bigger mess to have to contend with, maybe even a bigger mess than we can predict. And that would be my guess. Trump comes in, if they can.
Why am I doing that? Stop. No, sorry. Okay. I was getting ready too early.
Well, I was just going to say, ultimately, I just keep coming back to what you and I have been talking about for years. That's going to be the ultimate end to this thing. What Biden's actions have done, I believe, have probably added 6 to 10 months to the conflict, and more bloodshed, more gallons of blood, and adds nothing constructive to this thing.
I think it's pretty reprehensible, and it is. I mean, and just imagine if you think this is a good idea. I mean, imagine if this were the other way around, and like, let's say it was an incoming Democratic President Harris, and it was outgoing lame duck President Donald Trump, and he's fucking with Harris and trying to box her in on foreign policy on something as dangerous as something that could potentially provoke World War III. I think it's outrageous, really, truly. I mean, I agree. It's really gross behavior. All right, Scott, shall we enumerate where we can find all things Scott?
Or do we just leave it to the credits?
I'll just leave it to the credits. So, guys, we're going to run some credits. Please, please, please subscribe to us on YouTube and or on Rumble. It doesn't cost anything, particularly on YouTube or on Rumble. You can just hit follow. we know a lot of you people are listening. So if you're listening, please follow. All it does is it just adds us to the little bar of people that you can check out regularly, easily, without having to search for us. And it makes a huge difference because then we can monetize the show and make a little money and keep doing it. Okay, we're not going to keep doing it forever. And then people, oh, I used to like that. Whatever happened to it? Well, you got to put a ring on it. Or you got to put a follow on it. All right. So, so both on YouTube and on Rumble. If you're on Rumble, while it's rolling, you can also make a $5 a month contribution and become a paid subscriber. We'll be adding more sort of unique content to all that. But anyway, please subscribe at youtube.com. And remember, it's the @DMZ America podcast. The @ is super important, just as it is in the email. All right, here we go. Man. And there it is. Here come the credits. Check out all our stuff. Okay. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.